What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 9. Final look.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for this week's NFL slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay, guys, NFL Week 9. Let's take a look at the quarterback position. So at the quarterback position, I like Lamar Jackson from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Seattle Seahawks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Now, Lamar Jackson is averaging 21.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 9.3 rush attempts per game. He's going to be about 12% owned, projected at 21.1 fantasy points here this week. He's 8,200 DraftKings salary, 400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 44 points scored in this game. They have the Ravens favored by 6. So Lamar Jackson scored 12, 38, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He got 5, 9, and 13 rush attempts in those games. So only 5 rush attempts last game. That's nearly half his season average. So I'm sure that contributed to the lower fantasy production. But I do think it's a good bounce back spot. Now his price tag is not perfect here. Jalen Hurts actually $200 less on DraftKings. But Jalen Hurts does not have a great matchup facing Dallas, although Jalen Hurts is still a fantastic play. He's been much more consistent than Lamar Jackson. So pretty much the studs on the slate, Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. But if you're moving down in salary, take a look at Dak Prescott from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Philadelphia Eagles. This play makes a ton of sense. Probably my favorite play at the quarterback position this week. So the Eagles give up the 10th most, or they have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Now Dak Prescott averaging 17.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.3 rush attempts per game. But he's been hot, scoring 32 and 25 fantasy points in the last 2 games. It's going to be about 8% owned. And he's only 6,500 DraftKings salary, 1,700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47 points scored in this game. Close game with the Cowboys trailing by 3. So just about everything matches up here for Dak Prescott. He's got a great matchup in a relatively high scoring game, in a close competitive game, a game he's going to want to go out there and match the production of Jalen Hurts, who's sitting at 8,000 DraftKings salary. You got Dak Prescott at 6,500. So I like Dak Prescott here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, now coming down in salary a little bit more here. His last 3 games have been encouraging fantasy-wise. Although I don't love him as a player, he is putting up numbers the last 3 games. So take a look at Derek Carr from the New Orleans Saints playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 4th worst defense overall, give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So Derek Carr has averaged 14.8 fantasy points per game on the season, only gets an average of 1.9 rush attempts per game. It's going to be about 7% owned, projected at 16.3 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 5,700 DraftKings salary, 1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game. They have the Saints favored by 8.5. So a little bit of a risk there. If this game does get out of control, they could be handing the ball off quite a bit. might take the point production out of Derek Carr's hands, but it is a fantastic matchup, and he scored 22, 21, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So I don't mind him as a fantasy player this week. He's in a pretty good spot here. So I like Derek Carr here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. So stud on the slate that I like is Alvin Kamara from the New Orleans Saints playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 4th worst defense overall, giving up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. So Alvin Kamara averaging 22.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.8 pass targets per game, and 17.2 rush attempts per game. So a ton of volume here, and he's going to be about 22% owned, projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 8,100 DraftKings salary, 1,100 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Saints favored by 8.5. So with a good matchup, if they can get up by a couple touchdowns here, you're going to see a lot of Alvin Kamara. And even if they don't, you're going to see a lot of Alvin Kamara. So he's a good play here, going to get a lot of volume, or should get a lot of volume. Should be able to eat up this defense. He scored 27, 29, and 17 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 17, 17, and 19 rush attempts, on top of 5, 14, and 8 pass targets. So I like Alvin Kamara in a good matchup and a good game script here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, another stud that I like coming down in salary though is Josh Jacobs from the Las Vegas Raiders playing the New York Giants, who have a middle of the pack defense overall, but they do give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Josh Jacobs averaging 13.9 fantasy points per game on the season.
Real quick guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Getting an average of 16.6 rush attempts per game and 5.4 pass targets per game. Going to be about 22% owned, projected at 14.5 fantasy points here in week 9. He's 6,900 DraftKings salary, 600 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas only thinks there's going to be 37.5 points scored in this game, which isn't too bad. It's on the low side, and they've got the Raiders favored by 2, so you got a close competitive game here. Could turn into a running battle between Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley. They certainly will be the stars on the field. And now Saquon, so Josh Jacobs, first of all, he's 6,900 DraftKings salary. Now Saquon Barkley is 7,900 DraftKings salary. So if you have the salary, go ahead and play Saquon Barkley, who on paper, even with the matchup, looks to be in a better position here than Josh Jacobs. But if you do need to save the 1,000 salary, Josh Jacobs is a good mid-range option. So I like both of the running backs in this game. I would pick one or the other. And I like Josh Jacobs and Saquon Barkley here in this New York Giants versus the Las Vegas Raiders. Okay, now if you want to save some salary at the running back position, take a look at Ramondre Stevenson from the New England Patriots playing the Washington Commanders. And they have the 2nd worst defense overall. They're middle of the pack defending opposing running backs.
Now, Ramondre Stevenson has averaged 10.6 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 12.1 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 21% owned. He's been on the field for 65% of the snaps, projected at 11.7 fantasy points here this week. He's only $5,400 DraftKings salary, $800 more on FanDuel. And Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 2.5. So Ramondre Stevenson, he scored 7, 15, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 10, 9, and 10 rush attempts, on top of 4, 6, and 6 pass targets. So averaging right around 15 touches for the last 3 weeks, 15, 16 touches per game. He's got some monster upside here, and I like his salary. I like the matchup, so I like Ramondre Stevenson here versus the Washington Commanders. Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. So some studs on the slate that I like: A.J. Brown, CeeDee Lamb, Devontae Adams. And look at this, guys. I was all over Adam Thielen since day one when he was sitting at like $3,500 or $3,700 DraftKings salary. He's all the way up to $7,500 DraftKings salary, averaging 21.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10 pass targets per game. And that's where Draft Dashboard really helps you identify, especially in the first 6 weeks of the season, helps you identify these players that maybe they got traded. People don't really know their value in the new system, and they're super underpriced in their daily fantasy salary. But then you look at the stats and you can see that they're performing, that their average is really good, and they're getting tons of targets, yet their salary, like Adam Thielen was getting like 10 targets a game, and his salary was at $4,200. I mean, it just didn't make sense. So Draft Dashboard definitely helps to identify those plays. And then you ride a guy like Adam Thielen all the way up to $7,500 DraftKings salary. Now, this is probably when although he did score 15, 32, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 weeks off of 11, 13, and 13 pass targets, he does have a good matchup at home as well. Could absolutely go off once again. But let's get into these other picks here. Coming down in salary, take a look at a guy like Terry McLaurin from the Washington Commanders, playing the New England Patriots, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Terry McLaurin has averaged 13.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 11% owned, and he's been on the field for 84% of the snaps, projected at 13.1 fantasy points here in week 9. He's $5,600 DraftKings salary, $1,600 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 41 points scored in this game, with the Commanders trailing by 2.5. Now, Terry McLaurin, in a good matchup, he scored 17, 15, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games, off of 12, 9, and 11 pass targets. That volume just too good to ignore, and pretty consistent production the last 3 weeks as well. I think he's underpriced here in this matchup, so I like Terry McLaurin here versus the New England Patriots. Okay, another low salary wide receiver that I like is Nico Collins from the Houston Texans, playing the Tampa Bay Bucks, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Nico Collins has averaged 16.4 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6.9 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 12.1 fantasy points here this week. He's $5,800 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. So Nico Collins scored 7, 12, and 7 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 6, 6, and 4 pass targets. So I like Nico Collins here versus the Tampa Bay Bucks. And another low salary wide receiver that I like is Demario Douglas from the New England Patriots playing the Washington Commanders. And take a look at this. Might be one of my favorite low salary wide receivers on the slate. The Washington Commanders give up, they have the second worst defense overall. They give up the second most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Demario Douglas, he scored 8 and 11 fantasy points in his last 2 games. Looks like he just started playing these last 2 games off of 7 and 6 pass targets. Even got a rush attempt in each of those games. That's some added upside for a wide receiver. Going to be about 15% owned at only 4,000 DraftKings salary. 1,400 more on FanDuel. So I like Demario Douglas here versus the Washington Commanders. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I like TJ Hawkinson from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing tight ends. TJ Hawkinson averaging 14.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 8.5 pass targets per game, on the field for 83% of the snaps, going to be about 14% owned, projected at 12.2 fantasy points here tonight or this week. He's 5,200 DraftKings salary, 1,500 more on FanDuel. Now, Vegas does think this is going to be a low-scoring game, only 37.5 points scored in this game. The Vikings trailing by 3.5, but he's getting monster volume, 9, 12, and 8 pass targets the last 3 games. I don't expect that to change. So I like TJ Hawkinson here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, another tight end that I like is Dallas Goedert from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have a good defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Dallas Goedert averaging 10.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. And I like this pick because he's been on the field for 91% of the snaps. I think that leads all tight ends on the slate here. Tyler Higbee on the field for 92%, and Cade Otton on the field for 97% of the snaps. Actually, Cade Otton is a sleeper pick at only 3,000 DraftKings salary. Got 6 pass targets in both the last 2 games, scored 9 fantasy points in each of those games in a good matchup. So yeah, Cade Otton. But Dallas Goedert on the field for 91% of the snaps. Only 4,800 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. He scored 8, 19, and 9 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 7, 5, and 8 pass targets. So I think he's in a fantastic spot here this week. It's a good matchup and what should be a great game. So I like Dallas Goedert here versus the Dallas Cowboys.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.